experts are warning teens and younger kids all across the country that they are in the midst of a real mental health crisis.
The world is experiencing a mental health crisis, especially among young people. A whopping 90% of the US population believes the nation is in a nationwide mental health crisis, even in countries that on other parameters can boast of being robust welfare societies. The crisis is raging. For instance, in Denmark, the queue for the country's tag for a psychiatrist has become so long that on average you must wait a year to get an appointment. Since the crisis hit rich countries the most, a complacent attitude and unrealistic life expectations are often blamed as the root cause.
These little things, they all mount up and we call them stress buckets, and the people's stress buckets at the moment, they're just overflowing.
However, I think there are more concrete reasons for the crisis, and I believe it's essential that this debate eventually becomes so concrete that we can address the issues politically. So in this video, I will try to define 4 suggestions as to why the world is now experiencing a mental health crisis.
On the problems associated with loneliness by declaring it an American epidemic.
First reason, housing. We do often hear that the present is the most privileged of all epochs in human history. That is probably also true if we look at most of our material needs. However, there is at least one material need where it's difficult to make the case that we live in such glorious times: the general housing conditions, especially for young people. Being both a physiological and a safety need, there's no doubt that safe and stable living conditions are one of the most essential pillars for people's physical and psychological well-being.
A report by Shelter found a direct link between poor housing and poor mental health. Over half of adults surveyed were suffering with depression, and children were over 3 times more likely to demonstrate mental health problems.
From the 1960s to the beginning of this millennium, a home in the US cost approximately 4 times the median household income. Today, this ratio is almost 8. Similar depressing figures are seen over most of the world, here exemplified with the UK. Rents have generally also followed these trends and exploded in similar fashion, and generally exploded much worse in larger cities where young people often start their careers and get their education.
Rents in New York City are at an all-time high. In June 2022, citywide median asking rent reached $3,500. That's about a 35% increase from 2021.
High prices mean that many people must settle for worse housing conditions and/or more financial stress than they otherwise would. Many studies point to links between housing conditions and mental well-being. Based on such studies, UK's Mental Health Foundation makes the following links: stress, anxiety and depression, sleep problems, physical health problems that can affect mental health, and relationship difficulties. Second reason, hacked reward systems. Our brains haven't changed much since Homo sapiens appeared approximately 300,000 years ago on the African savanna as this thin, strange, ape-like figure. Here, the search for water and food was not only exhausting but also extremely dangerous. Relationships between people were not just for pleasure and love, but essential for survival. If one could not maintain these relationships and was excluded from one's group, it was often equivalent to a death sentence.
The caveman mind tells you need more food, you need more water, better weapons, better shelter. Unfortunately, in the modern world, this manifests as greed, dissatisfaction, craving, wanting. It's never enough. I need more, more, more.
The fact that Homo sapiens is still standing is not least due to our brain's reward systems. Through a chemical cocktail of, for instance, dopamine, oxytocin, and adrenaline, these neural reward systems motivated us to overcome danger when looking for food and prioritize our relationships, even in situations that put our own lives at risk. These reward systems are, in other words, extremely powerful and probably as strong and instinctive as 300,000 years ago and as in other wild animals.
So a very simple way of thinking about it is these drugs are tricking the reward circuitry to say, this stimulus, this experience is really important for my survival. I have to go do it again and again.
So when artificially engineered products that are unhealthy manage to activate some of these reward systems, addictive patterns of self-destructive behavior can emerge. An obvious example is, of course, drug addiction, but in this context I'm thinking more of something as ordinary as a trip to the supermarket. Here you will see a large amount of ultra-processed and engineered foods wrapped in materials that play on sensory receptors in our brains. The taste, texture and ingredients of such ultra-processed foods are often created through years of research in laboratories, so they work as symbiotically as possible with our brain's immediate reward systems.
Little dials being adjusted, ingredients here, softness, texture changes, changes in the colouring on the packets, flavouring changes, changes in the marketing campaigns. All of it leads to things that are fundamentally addictive.
Equally meticulous research is also applied by social media companies to create algorithms that activate instinctive elements in our pack animal brains that manipulate us into staying longer and longer on the platforms. Many, of course, have a balanced consumption of both ultra-processed foods and social media. However, the population in many countries gets more than 50% of the caloric intake from ultra-processed foods, and when an average social media user spends 2.5 hours on social media, then we can start talking about these partly artificial substitutes replacing our real food and at least to some extent replacing our real social interactions.
There's a deep hunger for connection, and the social media provides a simulacrum of connection, the pretense of connection. And so what do people have on social media? They have friends.
Replacing such essential needs as real food and real social interactions with something that's partly artificial does have a wide range of negative consequences in terms of health. Regarding mental health, all consumption of ultra-processed foods is associated with, among other things, depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. Our use of social media is also associated with anxiety and depression, as well as social isolation.
Third reason, chemical pollutants. You know there's an epidemic of low testosterone in young males.
Crazy. I was reading this stuff the other day. What is it?
It's because we're poisoning them.
For decades, the level of testosterone has been declining among men. A famous study revealed in 2007 a substantial drop in US men's testosterone levels since the 1980s, with average levels declining by about 1% per year. This means, for example, that a 6-year-old man in 2004 had testosterone levels 17% lower than those of a 6-year-old in 1987. Other researchers have later demonstrated similar developments in other countries with the most significant declines in developed economies. A primary suspect has also been found, PFAS, also known as forever chemicals.
High exposure to these two major PFAS alone have been linked to high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis, pregnancy-induced hypertension, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancer, and decreased response to vaccines.
These forever chemicals are a group of chemicals that are difficult to break down, even when exposed to high temperatures, wear from friction with other materials, and attrition from Mother Nature. This makes them, for instance, suitable for non-stick pans, as surface finishing on textiles, and as pesticides. Unfortunately, our bodies and nature in general also have difficulties breaking down PFAS. Therefore, when we consume them, for instance via a non-stick pan or pesticide-contaminated drinking water, they accumulate in our bodies and are also passed on to the next generation via breast milk. Low levels of testosterone in itself have negative consequences in terms of mental health.
Difficulty with motivation. People tend to gain weight and they have increased levels of moodiness and sometimes depression.
It's also likely, since PFAS can affect testosterone, that it can affect other hormones and thus cause other mental disorders. For instance, research shows a possible connection between ADHD and PFAS exposure. In addition, other chemical groups such as BPAs and phthalates are suspected of having similar endocrine disrupting effects on our health, including our mental health.
That's just one example of the many chemicals that can affect our hormone system.
Well, it's very frightening because that's not a reversible thing.
That's correct.
Right?
Fourth reason, impotent political institutions.
The problems I have mentioned are relatively easy to solve in theory. Governments worldwide have successfully solved housing crises in the past, for instance after major wars or rapid population growth.
Across the United States, new homes are springing up by the thousand for our rapidly growing population. Because we are an industrial nation, most of the people must live in urban areas.
However, solving the housing crisis today is politically challenging. Homeowners who make up the majority in most countries have a financial interest in keeping house prices high. Additionally, banks have skilled lobbyists to influence the political process, and today's financial sector is heavily dependent on mortgage debt and high house prices. We have also phased out chemicals in the past and can do so again.
Since the protocol went into effect on January 1st, 1989, the consumption of ozone-depleting substances, including CFCs, plummeted.
But there are always these battles between the interest of the industries and the public. There will of course be practical challenges too, but these practical challenges are relatively small compared to other crises. For example, the climate crisis is much more complicated than the housing crisis.
Climate change is apparently, by all reckoning, the most difficult type of problem for people to accept. It's far enough in the future and no individual is responsible. Everybody's responsible and there's no enemy.
Steering the world in a healthier direction in terms of food culture and social relations should also be much less of a challenge than, for example, steering the world in a less militaristic direction.
Russian airstrikes bombard Ukraine.
And regulating a list of chemicals is obviously easier than regulating AI technologies and predictable consequences. So when political institutions fail to solve relatively tangible crises, it's easy to lose faith in them. If our political institutions don't work, how can we expect our world to get better? We've become accustomed to seeing extroverted reactions to the impotence and corruption of our political institutions. We have especially witnessed this with climate protest, when protesters intervene in civil life, carry out vandalism and other actions that are considered criminal by our political institutions. However, we must remember that most reactions to the failure of our political institutions are introverted and passive. A global study revealed that 59% of adults and children between 16 and 25 are very or extremely worried about climate change. Extreme worry, and combined with the fact that our political institutions do not respond to our most pressing problems, can be traumatizing and develop into mental health issues. In the context of climate change, it's often referred to as climate anxiety. But anxiety over, for instance, the future housing market is just as real. It is hard to imagine how bad the housing crisis has to get before politicians take it seriously.
Applied for medically assisted dying, known as MAID. He lives in constant agony due to a back injury, but has started the process for end of life because his rooming house is up for sale and he can't find anywhere else to live that he can afford.
Therefore, the impotence and corruption of political institutions should also be on a list of reasons why young people suffer from adverse mental health. And those were my 4 suggestions. There are, of course, other reasons, and I'm sort of wondering which other ones would have been worth diving into. If you have other suggestions as to why the world is in a mental health crisis, I would appreciate your opinion in the comments. It could be interesting to make a follow-up video with other reasons for the origin of the mental health crisis at a later point. All the best.